So I'd now like to introduce Jonathan Rigg. Jonathan is Director of the Asia Research Institute and Professor of Geography at the National University of Singapore. He works on issues of agrarian transformation, poverty, vulnerability, migration, disaster and livelihoods in the Asian region, and has worked in Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Nepal and Sri Lanka. His recent books include Challenging Southeast Asian Development, The Shadows of Success, which Keith Barney holds a copy of, if anyone's looking to...
I have one too.
Oh, and so does Wolf. And his latest book is in press with Hawaii University Press, More Than Rural, Textures of Thailand's Agrarian Transformation. Over to you, Jonathan.
Okay, lovely to be here and see you all. We've had a fantastic 2 days. Seems longer, but in a good way. Okay, we were all asked to sort of give a paper which might speak to the Rupture's theme, and my one has this title, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, which is on Nepal. Just out of, kind of interestingly, it comes out of a project on earthquake resilience in Kazakhstan, Nepal, Bihar and China, and we were working, obviously this one's on Nepal. And so that project was all about seismic rupture, but it was about earthquake preparedness and resilience. So rather than the project that Sango's leading, which is obviously uses rupture as the entry point, this particular project used resilience as the entry point. It's probably just a different way of thinking about either change, or if you like, the absence of it, or what change does. Obviously this paper was written before the Rupture project was funded, and what I'm going to do is kind of talk very briefly about the paper, maybe think a little bit about where Rupture comes into it, and then use that to extend into work on Laos and Thailand. But I'll stick to 15 minutes if I can. Does anyone have a watch, or you get time?
I'll let you know when you've got time.
Okay,
right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So this is in Nepal. We're working on the Terai, and it's we're particularly interested in livelihoods, and it's a very difficult area to make a living. Landholdings are getting smaller, natural hazards are pronounced. It's an area that suffered very serious floods not very long ago. Obviously there was the earthquake in 2015, in fact just a couple of weeks after these photos were taken. It's also an area where there's been long-standing poverty. The Nepali government may not be a failed state, but it's not certainly an efficient state or an effective state in the way that many, say, East and Southeast Asian countries are. So this is Arubani, where we were working. Traditionally a very rural, kind of agrarian livelihood area, but like a lot of places in Southeast and East Asia, where there's been processes of kind of occupational multiplicity emerging. So people are doing more things, different things, in more places. And that's very characteristic, including migration. So what's happened in this particular area, increasing numbers of people traveling particularly to Malaysia as a way of making up for the inadequacies of the kind of agrarian economy. So that was the sort of background for this particular paper. And what we were interested in the paper was, well, the way we set it up was we're trying to draw a distinction between vulnerability and precarity. So this has always been a precarious place to make a living. And it, as I said, got high levels of poverty and rather kind of ineffective development interventions. But what has happened over the last 5 or 10 years, or at least this is the argument behind the paper, is that the nature of vulnerability has changed. Whereas in the past, vulnerability maybe was rooted in the uncertainties connected with a capricious climate and a problematic environment, lack of integration into the economy, not much support from state institutions and that sort of thing. More latterly, vulnerability has been connected with the way in which these places have been integrated into the mainstream, which is why we, from a kind of analytical point of view, draw a distinction between, if you like, backward-looking vulnerability and forward-looking precarity. And that sort of ties into work that I've been doing in Laos for a long time. So this is a land settlement, a resettlement village in Laos, and this was a report published by JICA a few years ago about the causes of poverty. And it's kind of very characteristic, I think, of the way in which vulnerability is thought about in terms of mainstream development institutions. So these were the reasons outlined in this particular report. And I'm sure you'll sort of think, yes, of course, low agricultural productivity, unstable agricultural production, limited access to physical resources, limited access to information, vulnerability of organisations, so on and so forth. And what these do, what this identification does, is it kind of creates a particular space for development intervention. So the identification of problems, so this problematization of the past, then of course creates the opportunity to intervene in particular ways. So I suppose it's kind of, I mean, it's different from what Christian was saying, but it was similar in the sense that how do we kind of express problems and how do people respond? So how do institutions respond to this? And so that's poverty in Nepal. I'll go forward a bit actually. One way for Laos was through land settlement. So this is a poster promoting land settlement in the Lao People's Democratic Republic. This is today Bachaban. So these are what it's like to live traditional lives. So you live in isolated communities in the hills, detached from the mainstream. And of course, what development interventions are intended to do is to bring people down from the hills. Here they are, happy and smiling, where you can then bring all these things to bear. Better diet, electricity, education, health, sanitation, clean water. And I suppose in the paper, what we're interested in is how those sorts of interventions create new types of vulnerability. So in the paper we have this table where we make I know this is kind of slightly artificial. I mean, it's not as if you move from vulnerability to precarity. Both these things coexist. But we found it kind of a kind of useful way of thinking about the difference between backward-looking vulnerability and forward-looking precarity. So vulnerability, the way we kind of conceptualized it, is inherited exposure to mainly kind of environmental risk, at least in this particular area, and we called this old poverty. Interventions come in as a way of addressing these sorts of problems. But in doing that, they create new uncertainties, which we kind of term new poverty. So this is produced exposure. So this is inherited, that's produced. And in the paper, we play around with we use the interviews with households to think about how these two things get produced and reproduced over time. Okay. Now kind of moving from Nepal into Thailand. So this is more recent work done last year and the year before last. I suppose the kind of question that arises from the Nepal work is how do households deal with that? How do they manage this kind of co-production of vulnerability and precarity? What sort of household strategies, in inverted commas, do they use? This is one household in northeast Thailand. Elderly couple live in this. They're in 12 rai of rice land, and that provides a subsistence to them. They also raise one grandchild who's at school in the village. And I suppose that's a sort of village-based understanding of this particular household context. In addition to these three, there's a daughter in Chachangsao, which is about 400 kilometres away, and she's working in the non-farm sector. It's her daughter who's being supported by her parents, and she's remitting 4,000 baht a month back to the Nepal household. She also receives rice from that land. So here we have this sort of a multi-sited household where a daughter in another place is connected in both a functional and an emotional sense with a Nepal household back in the village. There are also 2 other grandchildren, one at school in Bangkok and there's a grandchild in the army. And the daughter, of course, will inherit the land. So what we have here is a sort of a complex of production, reproduction, and redistribution. It's a little bit like some of the work that James Ferguson's been doing in southern Africa. That to understand their existence, you have to sort of place it in this bigger context. And so what we have here is, if you like, vulnerable living back in the village and precarious work in Choctaw. These 2 things are kind of manageable because of their connection. So it's not that people are moving from vulnerable lives to precarious lives. These 2 things are kind of coexisting at one and the same time. And then we were sort of wondering, well, how does that then get sort of imprinted generationally? And so this is some of the data we've been collecting. This hasn't been published yet. And I'll just explain this graph. This is farming, this is non-farming, and these is by age. So we're kind of starting here, 15 to 19, up to 80 plus. So what we have here is a sort of geriatrification of farming at the top and younger people at non-farming. So we have a kind of coincidence of problems, but those problems are also solutions. So we have the problem of aging farmers up here. We have the problem of absent youth down here. And of course, you also have the problem of left behind children. So that strategy of dealing with vulnerability and precarity is reflected in this sort of footprint, I suppose, of activity. Right. I sometimes show graduate students this painting, which I don't know, has anyone seen this painting before? Fantastic painting. It's called Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. It was thought to be by Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's probably not now. It's School of Peter Bruegel the Elder. When you look at it, you think, why is it called Landscape with the Fall of Icarus? You've got a man ploughing the field, you've got the ship sailing into the distance, you've got this shepherd looking up into the sky. And the reason why he's looking up into the sky is because Icarus is falling to earth and disappearing into the ocean. And I sometimes think this is what happens when, I do kind of research, that you look for certain things which is informed by, of course, the theories we embrace and the methods we use, and we find those things. So if we're looking for the everyday, which is here, we maybe miss the ruptures. That's where the rupture comes in. And whether we privilege the rupture or not kind of explains where. And of course, what we're doing in Sango's project is looking particularly at the fall of Icarus. And there's the rest of the stuff going on. Whether this, Auden actually wrote a fantastic poem about this particular painting. That the ploughman continues to plough his fields, the ship sails into the distance, the shepherd continues to herd his sheep. Life goes on, and yet this moment in kind of history almost goes unremarked, disappears. So where we look, the theories we use, the methods we employ, I think are really important in determining what sort of things we write about, where we focus our attention. And this is the last slide. And at the moment, I'm doing some work with Vanessa Lam at Melbourne and Melissa Marchake at the University of Ottawa on sand. We're looking at sand mining in Cambodia and Myanmar and how that sand ends up in Singapore. And this figure is from a paper which hopefully will be published sometime in the not too distant future. We're looking at the way in which taking a GPN perspective, so global production network perspective, or taking a livelihoods perspective, takes you in a very different direction. So it's a little bit like Peter Bruegel painting. So a GPN perspective takes the sand, you focus on the sand trade, you trace the commodity over time, it leads you to value transformation, wealth accumulation, and it leads to Singapore, expansion of Singapore's land area by 20% over the last 50 years or so. And that's the way you trace the story. If you take a livelihoods approach, you look at the way in which the sand erodes livelihoods, destroys people's living, and then you lead to marginalisation, perhaps precarity, which then forces labour migration to Singapore. So people end up working on the reclamation sites that are being driven by the sand that is going that way. So I think, in a way, what we're trying to do with this paper is show how, you know, a little bit, as I say, like that painting, kind of how we look, where we look, what kind of tracks we follow, takes us in profoundly different directions. That's it.